There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not feel like pain. It feels like stone, like the weight of old walls pressing inward without malice, simply existing, simply enduring, indifferent to whether you crumble beneath them or learn to carry them as part of your own skeleton. Mara Ashvale had lived inside that kind of loneliness for so long that she had stopped recognizing it as something separate from herself. It was not a wound. It was a condition. It was the shape of her life. And she had learned, with the quiet stubbornness of someone who has no other choice, to find beauty inside it. She woke every morning before the sun finished deciding whether it was worth rising. The ruins of Ashvale Keep had no windows that still held glass, which meant that the cold came in freely, carrying with it the smell of pine forest and damp earth, and something older that Mara had never been able to name, something that clung to the stone itself like memory. She dressed in the dark without thinking about it, her hands knowing the routine better than her eyes ever could. Wool undershirt, thick trousers, boots worn smooth at the heels but still holding together through sheer stubbornness. A coat that had belonged to her grandmother and still smelled faintly of the dried lavender her grandmother used to tuck into every pocket because she believed lavender kept bad spirits civil. The broom came next. Always the broom first. Mara had learned that if you tried to light the candles, before you swept, the dust would settle back onto the flames and make the whole hall smell like burning. So she swept first, beginning at the far eastern corridor where the roof had partially caved in 3 winters ago, and the debris still trickled in no matter how many times she cleared it, working her way methodically through the passages until she reached the Great Hall. The Great Hall was the heart of Ashvale Keep, or what remained of it. The ceiling vaulted 40 feet overhead, and most of it still held, which Mara considered nothing short of miraculous, given that the structure was, according to the oldest records she had found in the archive room, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. The stones were a dark gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The floor was uneven, tilted slightly toward the western wall where the foundation had shifted at some point in the distant past. And at the far end, on a raised dais of 3 wide steps, sat the throne. It was not a beautiful throne. Mara thought it important to be honest about that, especially since she had spent the majority of her 24 years of life in its company. It had probably been magnificent once, carved from a single piece of black stone that modern geologists would have called basalt, but that the old texts referred to simply as heart rock, the stone that forms where the earth bleeds. But centuries of neglect before her family had taken up their post had allowed moss to colonize the lower portions, and the carvings that had once decorated the arms and backrest were worn nearly smooth. You could still make out shapes if you looked closely in good light. Wolves, running in a circle that had no beginning and no end. Stars arranged in patterns Mara had tried to map against modern constellation charts, and never quite succeeded. And at the very top of the backrest, a single figure with its arms raised. Though whether in triumph or supplication, Mara had never been able to determine. She swept around the throne with the same care she brought to everything else. She was thorough without being obsessive, attentive without being precious. This was simply work, and work deserved to be done properly. Her grandmother had told her that. Her mother had told her that before she left, which was what the women in her family called it, when they could no longer endure the isolation and the humiliation and the weight of a duty that the rest of the world found either pitiable or laughable. They called it leaving. Mara had been 11 when her mother left. She had been raised by her grandmother after that, and her grandmother had stayed until she was simply too old and too tired to stay any longer, and then she had passed the broom and the candle box to Mara and closed her eyes one winter morning and did not open them again. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, Mara had been entirely alone. She did not say this to invite sympathy. She said it because it was the truth, and the truth had always seemed to her the most important thing to hold on to when everything else became uncertain. She was alone. She was an omega in a world that treated omegas as furniture at best and nuisances at worst. She lived in ruins that the ruling consulate of Pax had officially classified as a heritage preservation site. which was a bureaucratic way of saying they acknowledged the place existed without committing any resources to its upkeep or assigning any value to the person keeping it. Her stipend, paid quarterly by an administrative office 3 territories away, was enough to buy food and basic supplies if she was careful. She was always careful. After sweeping came the candles. Mara kept a supply of them in the archive room, ordered in bulk from a supplier in the nearest town who had learned not to ask questions about why a young woman living alone in old ruins needed quite so many candles. She lit them in a specific order, one she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother, a sequence that had been passed down for as long as anyone in their line could remember. 7 candles on the altar shelf to the left of the throne, 5 along the base of the dais, 3 on the mantel of the great fireplace on the eastern wall, which Mara could still use though she never lit it to full capacity because the chimney had never been properly inspected, and she had learned to be cautious about structural things she could not see. And finally, the single large pillar candle that sat directly on the seat of the throne itself, centered in the slight depression that years of moss growth had created there. This last candle was the one the other wolves always mentioned when they came to gawk, which they occasionally did, young pack members on some kind of heritage tour, organized by schools that wanted to give their students a sense of history without committing to anything genuinely educational. They would file in with their guides and their backpacks, and they would look at everything with the politely blank expressions of people who had been told something was significant without being given the tools to understand why. And inevitably one of them would point at the candle on the throne and ask why it was there. The guide would usually say something vague about old customs. If they asked Mara directly, which happened occasionally because she was always present during visits, maintaining the keep was her job after. All she would say that it was a light kept for the one who would return to sit there. They always laughed. Not cruelly, most of them. Just with the easy dismissiveness of people who have never needed to believe in something larger than what they could see. Mara never argued with them. She simply waited for them to leave. And then she went back to her work. She had never stopped believing. She was not entirely sure she could explain why, except that the keep itself seemed to ask it of her. There was something in the stones that resisted the category of dead. The air in the great hall had a quality that was different from the air in the rest of the ruins. Denser somehow, charged in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Mara had grown up reading that sensation as presence, as a kind of waiting that was not passive, but intentional, as though the space itself was holding its breath. Her grandmother had told her that the keep was alive in ways that mattered more than the ways most. Things were alive. She had believed her grandmother completely. And so every morning, she swept and she lit the candles, and she said the old words that her grandmother had taught her, the ones in the ancient wolf tongue that predated every modern pack dialect, the words whose meaning had been partially lost to time but whose rhythm still carried something true. She said them quietly, facing the throne, her hands loose at her sides. She did not feel foolish doing this. She felt, in some way she had never been able to articulate to anyone, that this was precisely what she had been made for. She could not have known, on the morning that everything changed, that she was right. If you have ever read old stories about impossible things becoming possible, you might have noticed that they rarely announce themselves. The moment of rupture is almost never dramatic in the way we expect drama to look. It does not begin with thunder. It does not begin with a beam of golden light. It begins with something small and strange that the ordinary part of your mind is desperate to explain away, and the deeper part of you, the part that has always known things you were never taught, goes absolutely still. For Mara, it began with warmth. She was in the middle of the old words, about halfway through the sequence, kneeling on the stone floor before the dais as she sometimes did when her knees allowed it. And she noticed that the air in the great hall had changed. Not in temperature exactly, or not. Only in temperature, but in quality. It was the difference between standing in an empty room and standing in a room that someone has just walked into, but you have not yet turned around to see them. Presence. Attention. The sense of being perceived. Mara finished the words. She always finished the words. Her grandmother had been very clear about that. Whatever happened, you finished the words. When she opened her eyes, the candle on the throne was burning differently. It was the same candle she had lit 20 minutes ago, half burned down already as they always were by this point in the morning. But the flame was not behaving the way a flame behaves when it burns alone in still air. It was reaching. It was leaning toward the back of the throne with unmistakable intention, like a compass needle finding north, like a hand reaching toward something it can sense, but not yet touch. Mara stood. She did not back away. She was not sure later why her instinct was to move closer, rather than away, except that fear had never been her primary relationship with this place. Whatever lived in these stones had always felt to her like something known, something old and fundamentally safe, even if it was also fundamentally vast. She climbed the 3 steps of the dais. The candle flame straightened as she approached and then bent again, this time toward the back of the throne, where the carved figure with raised arms was almost completely smoothed away. Mara reached out and touched the stone. It was warm. Not the warmth of a surface that has absorbed heat from nearby flame, but internal warmth. The warmth of something alive. The warmth of skin over a heartbeat. The stone moved, not violently, not with the grinding destruction you might expect from something that had been still for 3,000 years. It moved the way a sleeper moves when they shift position in the early morning, that unconscious, deeply inhabited motion that belongs entirely to rest and not at all to waking. The entire throne seemed to exhale. The moss along the base darkened, then brightened, then fell away in a cascade of green that crumbled to dust before it reached the floor. The carvings on the arms sharpened. The wolves running in their endless circle became suddenly, perfectly clear, each individual wolf distinct, each face turned not forward but slightly toward the center, toward the throne, as though they had always been looking at something, and Mara had simply not been able to see it until now. And then the figure in the throne moved. He had been there all along. That was the impossible thing. She had lit a candle on his chest every morning for 3 years, had swept around his feet, had said the old words 6 inches from where his hands rested on the arms of the throne. He had been indistinguishable from the stone because he had been held inside it, preserved in some state that was not sleep and not death, but something older than either word. He was as gray as the basalt around. Him, the same texture, the same temperature that was now warming rapidly under her hand. And then, as she watched, color returned to him the way light returns to a room when someone opens a curtain, not all at once, slowly, first in his hands, where the knuckles were pressed against the stone, then moving up his arms, across his shoulders, into his neck and face. His eyes opened. They were gold, not amber, not hazel, not the warm brown that some wolves' eyes shifted toward when their animals were close to the surface. Gold, as in the element. Gold as in something that does not corrode, does not diminish, does not change under any conditions the natural world can produce. They were the most fully present eyes Mara had ever seen in her life, as though every other pair of eyes she had looked into had been looking at something else at the same time. And these were looking only at her. He looked at her for a long time, without speaking. She looked back. She was not sure she was capable of looking away. When he finally spoke, his voice was the low, continuous sound of a river that has been running for a very long time. It did not feel like hearing so much as feeling, something that bypassed the ear and went directly to the chest. He spoke in the ancient tongue, the same one she had been using for the old words all her life, and she understood him completely, which was strange because she had always thought her understanding of that language was imperfect, stitched together from partial translations and her grandmother's fragmentary explanations. But when he spoke, it was as if the language lived in her body, in a way it had not lived in her mind, as if it had been waiting in her bones for a voice to call it out. He said, "You kept the light." Mara said, because it was true, and she was a person who defaulted to truth in moments of extremity. Every morning, he closed his eyes briefly, and the expression that crossed his face was not relief exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and more complete than either of those words. It was the expression of someone who has waited for something so long that they had stopped expecting it without stopping hoping for it, and who is now confronted with the reality of its arrival. He pressed his hands flat against the arms of the throne. His fingers had become entirely human in color now, long and scarred in ways that told a story Mara did not yet know, and they gripped the stone as though testing whether it would hold. "How long?" he asked. She told him, 3,000 years approximately, give or take the uncertainty that comes with records that old. She told him calmly, because she was a calm person, and because she sensed that what he needed from her right now was not emotion, but steadiness. The same steadiness she had been offering this hall every single morning for the last 3 years. She watched his face absorb the number. She watched him decide not to break under it. Then he stood, and the scale of him reorganized the room. He was not monstrous. She wanted to be precise about that, because the word had a tendency to attach itself to stories involving very large, very old supernatural beings. And it was the wrong word here. He was simply present in a way that ordinary bodies were not present. Tall, broad through the shoulders, built in the proportions of someone who had been made for carrying the world, rather than simply living in it. The clothing he wore was ancient, a long coat of some heavy, dark material that should by all rights have crumbled to dust, preserved by the same magic that had preserved him. He stood on the dais and looked around the hall, and Mara watched him see it, watched him register the moss and the missing sections of wall and the uneven floor and the absence of everything that had once surrounded this throne. She watched him understand the scope of what had passed. He looked back at her. He said, "You are alone here." "Yes," she said. "You have been alone here for how long?" She told him 3 years entirely alone. She told him she had been raised here, that her family had been keepers of this place for generations, that she was the last of them currently fulfilling that role. She told him all of this plainly, without performing either pride or shame about it, because it was simply her life, and she had made her peace with it. He stepped down from the dais. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the relationship between his body and space after a very long absence, but there was nothing fragile in it. Each step was a decision. He reached the floor of the hall and stood close enough that Mara had to look up to maintain eye contact, something she was not accustomed to because she was taller than most of the pack wolves she occasionally encountered in town. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mara Ashvale," she said. "Guardian of the keep." Something shifted in his expression at the word guardian, something that looked like it hurt. He said, "Ashvale, your family has kept this place. For a very long time, yes. And the packs? The consulate? The council?" She told him about those too, briefly and honestly. About the modern governing structure of the wolf world. About the territorial system. About the hierarchy of Alpha, Beta, Omega that had calcified over the centuries into something rigid and unkind. She told him about the stipend and the heritage preservation classification, and the tours with school groups who did not know what they were looking at. She told him about the way Omegas were treated, because it seemed relevant given that she was one, and he was clearly a person who would want relevant information. She told him all of it without anger, though the anger was there if you knew where to look for it, pressed down under years of pragmatism into something dense and quiet. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "That is not what I built." "No," she agreed. "I don't think it is. Please, if you are watching this for the first time, leave a like below. These stories take everything I have to tell, and knowing that you are here makes every word worth writing." His name was Caleum. She had known the name from the old texts, had spoken it occasionally in the old words, though she had always treated it as a title or an honorific rather than a personal name, the way one says the king without expecting the king to answer. But it was his name. He told her this on the first morning, sitting in the hall while she made a fire in the great fireplace, because he had been frozen for 3,000 years, and regardless of supernatural origin, a man needed warmth, she decided, and she decided it with the same matter-of-fact practicality she brought to every problem. She had inspected the chimney as best she could with a long-handled brush, and decided the risk was acceptable. The fire was her gift to the situation. He sat near it and told her his name, and watched the flames with the expression of someone cataloging a sensation they had not expected to miss. She sat across from him on the stone floor, which she was accustomed to, and looked at him without trying to hide that she was looking, because she had never been skilled at pretending not to do what she was doing. He was real. He was present. He was sitting in her hall drinking the tea she had made from the small camp stove she kept in the archive room, because she had never thought it worth installing a proper kitchen in a building she technically shared with a 3,000-year-old sleeping legend. These were the facts of the situation, and she was arranging them carefully. "You know what I am," he said. It was not quite a question. "You are the first Alpha," she said, "the one who established the original covenant between the wolf spirit and the human body, the one who wrote the founding laws, the one who the old texts say sleeps under the ancient throne until the devotion of a true guardian calls him back." He was quiet for a moment. "You recite it very calmly. I have had a long time to think about it. And you believed it? All this time you believed you might actually wake me?" She considered the question carefully, because it deserved care. "I believed the words were true," she said finally. "I believed the duty was real. Whether that translated into expecting you to actually sit up and speak to me over tea was less certain. But I did the work regardless, because the work was worth doing, whether or not it produced results I could see." He looked at her with those gold eyes, and she held the look without flinching, which she was fairly sure most people did not do. He said, "In my time, Omegas were the wisdom keepers, the ones who held the old knowledge because they were trusted to tend it carefully. In your time," she said, "sounds like a different world." It was. His voice carried something she had started, calling weight, not heaviness in the unhappy sense, but density, the quality of words that have been forged, rather than simply spoken. "Tell me about now. Tell me everything." So she told him. She had a detailed and well-organized understanding of the wolf world, because she had spent her life reading every document that passed through the archive room, every pack newsletter that came with supply deliveries, every report filed by the consulate inspectors who came through once a year to confirm the keep had not collapsed. She knew the territorial structure, and the governing hierarchy, and the way resources were distributed, and the formal and informal rules that governed Omega life, with the precision of someone who had studied the system that determined her existence, with the grim thoroughness of someone who has no power to change it, but refuses to be ignorant of it. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "The consulate. Who sits on it?" 7 Alphas, one from each of the major territorial packs. They rotate leadership every 5 years, theoretically. In practice, the Halverson pack has held the chairmanship for the last 40 years. "Halverson," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "I do not know that name." "You would not. They rose after the Consolidation Wars 2 centuries ago." She paused. "There are records in the archive room. If you want to understand the lineage of power since your time, the archive is probably the best place to start. It is incomplete, but better than nothing." He looked at her steadily. "You would share this with me. It is your keep," she said. "I am the guardian of it. Guarding means preserving, and preserving means sharing what I have preserved with the one who has the right to it." She picked up her tea, found it had gone cold, and put it back down. "Besides, I think you are going to need it." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to a smile on his face, and it reorganized his features in a way that made her understand, suddenly and with some force, that he had not always looked as serious as he looked right now, that the gravity she had been reading as his fundamental nature was in fact a specific response to a specific situation, and that underneath it was a person who was capable of warmth. She filed this information carefully. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "No," she agreed. "Why not?" She thought about it. "You have been here all along," she said. "I have been talking to you, in a manner of speaking, for years. It would be strange to be afraid of someone I already know, even if I only knew them as a presence." He was quiet for a long time after that. The fire cracked and settled. Outside the keep, the wind moved through the pines with that low, continuous sound that Mara had stopped hearing years ago, except in moments like this when she became newly aware of it. She watched him sit with whatever he was carrying, which was 3,000 years of everything, and she did not try to make it easier, because she did not think it could be made easier, and she had never been the kind of person who offered comfort that cost nothing. Finally, he said, "I need to understand what I have returned to before I can decide what to do about it." "That seems wise," she said. "Will you help me?" She looked at him. She thought about the years of swept floors and lit candles and spoken words in an empty hall. She thought about her grandmother saying that the work was real, whether or not anyone living could see the purpose of it. She thought about what it meant that the purpose had been this, had always been this, had been working toward this moment, while she went about her ordinary days entirely unaware that the ordinary days were the magic. "Yes," she said, "I will help you." And that, though neither of them knew it yet, was the second time a single word from Mara Ashvale changed the course of history. The first had been 3 years ago, on the morning she took up her grandmother's broom without being asked, and said, to the empty hall and the cold stone, and the presence she could feel but not see, that she would stay. The next several days had the quality of something being carefully constructed from materials that had not been used in a very long time, like watching a skilled craftsperson restore an ancient instrument, tightening strings that had loosened with age, adjusting components worn smooth by disuse, testing each piece before moving to the next. Caleum was learning the present, and Mara was learning him, and both processes required the same combination of patience and attention that she had always understood as her particular strength. She showed him the archive room first. It was the best room in the keep by Mara's private assessment. Not the most impressive, but the most alive, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelving that her ancestors had built and reinforced over generations, each shelf holding a combination of properly bound documents and more informal collections of notes and letters and loose papers that had accumulated over the centuries of the Ashvale guardianship. She had organized them herself over the past 3 years, spending the long winter months doing the work of a proper archivist, because if she was going to be here, she was going to be useful, and the condition of the archive when her grandmother passed it to her had been chaotic enough to be a genuine, professional problem. Caleum stood in the archive room doorway and looked at the shelves for a long time. She watched his face and she could see him processing, not just what was there but the shape of what was not there. The gaps that 3,000 years of history produced even in a carefully maintained collection. There was no record of the first several centuries at all. The earliest documents Mara had were approximately 1,200 years old, and they were fragments, partial records that referenced events as already historical that must have been living memory at some earlier point. "What is missing?" he said. It was not a question. The first millennium, essentially. There are references to earlier documents, but the documents themselves are gone. Fire, flood, deliberate destruction possibly. Hard to know from this end. Deliberate destruction, he repeated, and the particular quality of his voice on those 2 words told her that this possibility was not entirely surprising to him. She looked at him carefully. "You knew there were people who would not want the original records preserved. I knew there were people who would benefit from the original records not surviving," he said. His voice was level in the way that level voices can be more frightening than raised ones. The founding laws were very specific about the nature of the Omega gift. If those laws were preserved in their original form, they would be difficult to misinterpret. If only fragments survived, selective fragments, it would be possible to build a very different structure from what remained. Mara stood in the archive room and felt the hairs on her arms rise. She had spent years piecing together the history of Wolf Society from incomplete records, and she had developed, through that work, a scholar's instinct for the shape of deliberate absences, the particular texture of a gap in the record that comes not from accident, but from intention. She had noticed those gaps without having the context to understand them. Now, with Caleum standing in her archive, describing a conspiracy that had apparently been seeded 3,000 years ago, the gaps were resolving into a picture. "Tell me what the original laws said," she said. About Omegas. Tell me exactly. He did. He told her for 2 hours, standing in the archive room, speaking from memory that was apparently perfect, because he had written the laws himself, and the things you write yourself, with your whole understanding of why. They matter, you do not forget. He told her about the original tripartite structure of Wolf Society, which was not the hierarchy it had become, but a system of complementary gifts. Alphas carried the gift of protection and decision in moments of crisis. Betas carried the gift of community and negotiation, the constant work of keeping people connected. Omegas carried the gift of wisdom and continuity, the memory of where the pack had been and the vision of where it needed to go. No tier was above the others. That was the founding principle. Each gift was necessary. Each person who carried any gift was owed the full dignity of their place in the community. An Omega's counsel was not optional for an Alpha who wanted to lead well. It was required. It was written into the covenant. Mara listened and felt something shifting in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, and was perhaps the thing that lives between them. The feeling of understanding that something you were told was your insignificance was actually someone else's fear of your significance. They took the Vision Keepers, she said when he finished, and they turned them into servants. Because vision is dangerous, Caleum said. Because someone who can see where you are going and tell you clearly that you are going in the wrong direction is a profound threat to anyone who needs to go in the wrong direction for their own benefit. They looked at each other in the archive room, with its shelves of carefully organized partial truths. Outside, the wind was doing its thing in the pines. Inside, the candles burned in the sequence her grandmother had taught her, the light steady and clear. We need to find what was destroyed, Mara said, or what was hidden rather than destroyed. Records that old, if someone hid them rather than burning them, they might still exist somewhere. There was a second archive, Caleum said. It was not in this keep. It was held by a separate lineage, a family who were specifically tasked with maintaining the original documents in a location that was not publicly known. He paused. I do not know if that lineage survives. Give me their name, Mara said. I will find out. He looked at her with those gold eyes, and she could see him processing the fact of her, the reality of who she was, against the backdrop of what she was doing. This Omega woman in a worn coat in a ruin, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who simply assumed that hard things could be accomplished because hard things had never stopped her before. She could see him finding something in her that he recognized from a very long time ago, something he had not expected to find still intact after 3,000 years of systematic effort to dismantle it. Vithara, he said. The lineage was called Vithara. Mara pulled a notebook from the shelf, uncapped her pen, and wrote it down. Subscribe now, if you have not yet, because this story is only beginning, and what comes next will test everything Caleum thought he understood about what he had returned to. The word reached the consulate on the 5th day after Caleum's awakening. Mara had not sent it. She had been careful about communication in those first days, operating with the instinct of someone who understands that the moment powerful people learn something, they will move to control it. And she had wanted Caleum to have some time to find his footing before the political machinery started moving. But the wolf world had its own information channels, and one of the school tour guides who had visited 3 months prior and been struck by what he described as a strange energy in the old hall, had happened to post something vague but suggestive on the territorial pack network the day after Caleum woke, because he had felt something shift in the morning air and made the connection in some half-dreaming way he could not entirely explain. By the 5th day, the consulate had sent an inquiry, which arrived in the form of a terse official letter delivered by a pack courier who knocked on the massive main door of the keep with the expression of someone who had not expected the door to open and was visibly rattled when it did. Mara accepted the letter, thanked the courier with the politeness she brought to all interactions regardless of context, and brought it inside to read. The letter was addressed to the Heritage Site Guardian, which was what official correspondents always called her, and it asked, in the formal language of bureaucratic institutions that have suddenly become alarmed, for confirmation of whether any unusual activity had occurred at the site in recent days, and whether any unauthorized individuals were on the premises. Mara read the letter twice. Then she took it to Caleum. He read it in the archive room, standing at the reading table she had set up for him when it became clear on the second day that he intended to work through the entire collection systematically and would benefit from a surface to spread documents on. He had been there most of the morning. He had been absorbing 12 centuries of recorded wolf history with the focused efficiency of someone who was not reading for interest, but for the purposes of specific, tactical understanding. She had brought him food twice, and he had eaten it without looking up, which she found she did not mind. He read the letter and set it down. They know something has changed. They suspect, she said. They do not know what. The network post that prompted this was vague enough that they are probably covering several possibilities simultaneously. If they discover I am here before I am ready to meet them on my own terms, they will attempt to control the situation. Yes, she said. That is my assessment as well. What would controlling the situation look like? She thought about it carefully, because it deserved careful thought. Officially, they would claim a legal interest in any individual present at a heritage preservation site without authorization. They would invoke the site management protocols. Basically, they would treat you as a trespasser and use the administrative machinery to contain you while they figured out what you actually were and what to do about it. She paused. Unofficially, the Halverson Pack has held political power for 40 years, partly through the narrative that the old founding traditions are historical footnotes rather than living documents. Your existence directly threatens that narrative. If Chairman Halverson understood who you were, he would move to neutralize that threat before it could be organized. Neutralize, he said. I am trying to be accurate rather than alarming, she said. But yes, the Halverson Pack is not known for half measures. Caleum was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she had started calling its focused mode. The particular density that meant he was not simply thinking, but deciding. I need more time. The Vithara. Lineage search. The reconstruction of the original laws. These things cannot be rushed. No, she agreed. What do you want to do about the inquiry? What would the guardian of this site normally do with such an inquiry? Mara looked at him. Then she allowed herself a small, private smile. Respond with the standard acknowledgement. Nothing unusual to report. Site is secure. Thank you for your interest in the preservation of our cultural heritage. Can you do that without lying? I can choose what counts as reportable within the terms of my specific administrative designation, she said. The inquiry asks about unauthorized individuals on the premises. You are not unauthorized. You are the original owner. He looked at her with the gold eyes. You have a precise mind. I have had a lot of time to develop it, she said. She wrote the response that afternoon. It was a masterwork of technical accuracy, arranged in a manner that conveyed nothing. She had spent years developing this skill. In the letters, she wrote to the consulate's administrative office, because the administrative office had a persistent, low-level interest in whether the heritage site was being maintained adequately, and she had learned that the most effective responses were those that answered every specific question asked, while providing no purchase for follow-up questions. She sealed the letter, gave it to the next courier who passed through 3 days later, and went back to her work. Meanwhile, Caleum had begun, with the methodical patience of someone who understands that civilization is rebuilt one piece at a time, the process of reconstructing what had been lost. He worked from his own memory, which was extraordinary, cross-referencing against the fragments in the archive that confirmed or complicated what he recalled. He was building a document, written in his hand on the paper Mara provided, that was not a transcription of the original founding laws, but a reconstruction of them, annotated, with the evidence that supported each element of the reconstruction. It was painstaking work, and he did it without complaint. Mara assisted by doing what she did best, which was knowing where things were, and anticipating what would be needed before it was asked for. She pulled relevant archive documents before he identified a need for them. She flagged inconsistencies she had noticed in her years of reading that now made sense in the light of what he was telling her. She made tea and kept the candles burning and maintained the quiet, functional order that she had maintained in this space for 3 years, except that now the space contained a person who was actually alive and actually present in the way that made the work feel not merely purposeful, but urgent. They talked. That was not something she had anticipated as a feature of this situation, but it was perhaps the most significant one. She had lived for 3 years with nothing but her own thoughts for company and the sense of presence that was not quite communication. And now there was a voice in the hall, and it was directed at her with the full attention of someone who found what she said genuinely worth hearing. He asked her about her life with the focused curiosity of someone gathering necessary data. But the questions did not feel like extraction. They felt like interest. Real interest. The kind that has no agenda beyond wanting to understand. She told him about her childhood in the keep with her grandmother. She told him about the education she had given herself from the archive and from the books she ordered through the same supplier as the candles. She told him about the pack towns she had visited to gather supplies, the way the other wolves looked at her, the particular combination of pity and contempt that the wolf world reserved for lone omegas with no pack affiliation, no alpha to account for them, no status marker that made them legible within the social code. She told him about this without bitterness, or with only the amount of bitterness that honesty required, because she had made her terms with it years ago. He listened to all of it. When she finished the sections that described specific incidents of dismissal or humiliation, those occasions when a pack member had spoken to her as though she were not quite a full person, he would go very still in a way that she read correctly as the control of a response he had decided it was not yet time to act on. She respected that control. She understood the discipline of not reacting before you had the full picture. One evening, about a week after his awakening, they were in the great hall after dinner, the fire going properly now because she had inspected the chimney herself with a mirror and a long rope and determined it was sound, and he asked her, "Did it make you doubt? The years of the work without any visible result?" She sat with the question honestly. "There were mornings," she said, "when it felt like an elaborate habit, rather than a true duty. When the rational part of me would ask whether I was simply doing what I had been taught to do, without any real understanding of why." She paused. "But then there would be a morning when the air in the hall had that quality, that feeling of something waiting with intention, and I would think that the thing I could not explain was more real than the explanation I had access to. So I kept going. And if I had not woken," he said, "if you had done all of this, and I had never stirred, would it have been worth doing?" She considered this carefully. "Yes," she said, "because the work was true regardless of the result. I kept faith with something I believed was real. Whether or not the thing I believed in had the courtesy to confirm its existence was not what made the faith worth having." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I chose this sleep knowing it would require someone like you. I did not know it would take 3,000 years. I did not know what I would return to." He looked at the fire. "But I knew the person who woke me would need to be someone who understood that some things are worth doing without any promise of a return." She looked at him. Something was happening between them, that she was naming carefully in her own mind, identifying its components with the precision she brought to everything. It was not simple gratitude on his part, or simple loyalty on hers. It was something that had been building for a long time from a direction she had not been watching, something that had been growing in the space between the old words and the presence in the stone, something that she had perhaps been tending without knowing it, the way you can tend a fire by keeping the conditions right without ever seeing the flame directly. She did not name it out loud that evening. Some things needed more time to be held before they were spoken, but she did not pretend, in the privacy of her own careful mind, that she did not know what it was. The Vithara search took 12 days. Mara conducted it through the channels available to her, which were more extensive than they might have appeared from the outside, because she had spent 3 years building a correspondence network with other archivists, historians, and preservation specialists across the wolf world, the kind of professional relationships that develop between people who work in obscure corners of institutional memory and recognize each other as kindred. She framed her inquiry as historical research, which was accurate enough, asking whether any of her correspondents had encountered references to a family or lineage called Vithara in connection with early founding period documentation. The response came from an unexpected direction. An elderly archivist named Doris Vance, who maintained the record collection for a small pack in the Northern Territories, sent a letter that began with the observation that she had not heard that name in 50 years and had begun to wonder if she had imagined the reference she remembered. She had, it turned out, encountered the word Vithara once in a fragmentary document that had been filed under miscellaneous founding period materials, a category that in Doris's collection meant things that did not fit anywhere else, and that no one had looked at in decades. The document had described the Vethera lineage as keepers of the Covenant Archive, separate from the main historical records, maintained in a location, described only as the place that does not announce itself. Mara read this letter to Caleum in the archive room. When she reached the phrase, the place that does not announce itself, he made a sound she had not heard from him before. Something low and involuntary that was not words, but communicated everything. "You know what that means," she said. "It was the name we used for this keep," he said. "In the very early period, before it was called Ashvale Keep, before it was called anything. It was the place that does not announce itself, because its power was not visible to those who were not looking for it." He looked at her steadily. The secondary archive was not in a separate location. It was here, in this keep, hidden within the primary site, because the assumption was that anyone looking for dangerous records would look everywhere except the place they already thought they controlled. Mara went very still. Then she turned and looked at the archive room with new eyes. She had organized this space herself over 3 years. She knew every shelf, every document, every piece of the collection. She also knew, with the thoroughness of someone who had done a physical inventory as part of the organization process, that the room was slightly smaller than it should be, based on the exterior dimensions of that section of the keep. She stood up. She went to the east wall of the archive room, the one she had always thought was simply a stone wall with no apertures or features. She put her hands on it and felt it carefully, methodically, starting at the floor and working upward. Caleum watched from the doorway without speaking. It took her 45 minutes and 2 false starts, and a moment of genuine doubt around the halfway mark. But she found it. A section of stone in the lower east wall, approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, that did not behave like the stone around it when she pressed at specific points along its edges. It was sealed in some manner she could not identify by touch alone. Something that might have been a mechanical lock, or might have been something older, but it gave when she applied pressure at the right combination of points, and gave again. And a section of the wall shifted inward on some ancient pivot mechanism that should have seized up centuries ago, but had apparently been preserved by the same magic that had preserved everything else in this impossible place. Behind the wall section was a space perhaps 6 feet deep, and, in that space, wrapped in a material that looked like simple cloth, but that crinkled with the stiffness of something that had been treated to resist time, were documents. Mara knelt on the floor in front of the hidden space and looked at what was there. She could feel Caleum behind her, standing in the archive room doorway, and she could feel the quality of his attention, which was different from his usual focused stillness. It was the quality of someone who has not allowed themselves to hope for something specific and is now confronted with the specific thing. She turned and looked at him. She said, "Tell me how to handle these so I do not damage them." He told her. She followed his instructions exactly. And together, over the next 3 hours, they brought the Covenant Archive into the light. There are moments in history that hinge on small things. A letter that arrives one day late. A door that holds when it should have broken. A woman who stays when everyone else has gone. The contents of the Covenant Archive were everything Caleum had said they were, and more. Original documents in his own hand, sealed with a mark she had seen on the throne's carvings and never known to read, containing the full text of the founding laws, including every provision that had been excised or distorted in the centuries since his sleep, including the full, unambiguous language about Omega dignity and the nature of the Omega gift, including, buried in the third document, a passage that made Mara sit back on the stone floor and press her hand to her mouth. The passage described the conditions for the Caleum's awakening. She had known the broad outline of this. It was in the oral tradition her grandmother had passed down. But the original text was more specific and more extraordinary than anything she had been told. The awakening required not simply the presence of a devoted guardian, but the presence of the right guardian, one who carried a specific quality of understanding that the text described with a precision she found almost embarrassing to read in the original tongue, because the qualities it described were her qualities, the capacity for devotion without expectation of return, the ability to find meaning in work that no one else valued, the willingness to stay. And then the passage continued. It said that the guardian who woke the first alpha would be recognized not as a servant of the restoration, but as its foundation, that the bond between them would not be the standard mate bond of wolf custom, which was biological and involuntary, but a chosen bond, a covenant bond, the rarest and most binding form of connection the wolf world knew, which required both parties to understand fully what they were choosing before they chose it, that it could not be forced and could not be mistaken for anything else once it was made, and that the founding laws themselves, in their original form, would recognize the guardian as a co-author of the restoration. Mara read this passage 3 times. On the 3rd reading, she became aware that Caleum was very still. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the gold eye's usual quality of focused attention, which she had come to read as his default relationship to the world. This was something that had come through from underneath that attention, something personal and unguarded and very careful, the expression of someone who is holding something they understand to be fragile. "You did not know," she said. "I wrote those words," he said. "I wrote them 3,000 years ago. I understood what they meant abstractly. I did not know what they would mean specifically until this moment." She sat with that. She sat with the Covenant archive in her lap, and the hidden space open in the wall beside her, and the candles burning in their sequence throughout the keep, and 3 years of mornings making a shape she could finally see completely. She sat with the feeling in her chest that she had been naming carefully for the past several days, and that now had a name that was larger than the one she had given it, and that fit perfectly. "This would need to be a choice," she said, "not a requirement, not something that follows from what I have already done, an actual choice made with full understanding." "Yes," he said immediately, with a conviction that told her the answer had been ready for some time. "And I would need time," she said, "to understand what I am choosing. I am not the person who makes decisions quickly." "I know," he said. And then, more quietly, "I have waited 3,000 years. I can wait as long as you need." She looked at him. She thought about what her grandmother had told her in the last winter, about how the old stories always made the impossible things sound like they arrived fully formed, when actually they had been growing in the ordinary days all along, and the moment of recognition was just when you finally turned to look at what had already been there. She thought about the fact that she had been talking to him, in her particular quiet way, every morning for 3 years. She thought about the feel of the warm stone under her hand on the morning he woke. She did not say anything else that evening, but she did not look away. "Drop a comment below and tell me if you believe some things in your life have been growing in the ordinary days without you knowing it. I want to hear your stories." DDI. Consulate's second communication arrived 3 weeks after the first, and it was considerably less politely worded. It had been prompted, Mara deduced from the specificity of its language, by a report from someone within the pack network who had actually managed to get useful information about what was happening at the keep. She had been careful, but she was one person, and Caleum was not exactly inconspicuous. And during one of her supply trips into town, she had been seen in conversation with a historical records specialist she had contacted about the Vithera search, and the historical records specialist had, innocently and without any understanding of what she was involved in, mentioned to someone in town that the Ashvale Guardian had been asking unusual questions about founding period documentation. The second letter did not ask for confirmation of unusual activity. It informed her that a consulate inspection team would be visiting the site within the week, and that she was required, by the terms of her Heritage Guardian designation, to facilitate full access to the premises. She brought the letter to Caleum. He read it. Then he said, "It is time. You are ready?" She asked. "I am as ready as I will be," he said, which is different from ready. But the work we can do quietly is largely done. The Covenant archive is transcribed, and the transcriptions are stored in 3 separate locations. He paused. He had been the one to insist on multiple copies in multiple locations, and she had thought at the time that this was the instinct of someone who had learned through painful experience what happened to single copies of important documents. The reconstruction of the founding laws is complete. The Vithara documentation has been authenticated and cross-referenced, and the Halverson pack will have people in that inspection team, she said. Yes, and the moment they confirm what is here, the chairman will move to suppress it. Yes, he said again. Which is why we cannot allow the first revelation of this to happen in a context the consulate controls. He had been thinking about this, she knew, with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. We need to be the ones who announce this, on our terms, in a manner that puts the documentation in the public record before anyone can suppress it. The Pack Historical Society Conference, Mara said. She had been thinking about this too, because thinking ahead was a reflex for her. It convenes in 3 weeks. It is open to any pack or affiliated individual who registers. It is broadcast across the territorial network. If you presented the Covenant archive there, in front of witnesses from every major territory, before the consulate had time to manage the information, the documentation would be on the public record. He looked at her. You have already thought this through. I had some time while you were reading, she said. The small thing that happened at the corner of his mouth was definitely a smile this time. It was still restrained, still careful, but it was real. She found it affected her more than she would have predicted. They spent the following 3 days preparing. Mara wrote the registration letter to the Pack Historical Society Conference, identifying the presenter as a scholar specializing in founding period documentation, which was technically accurate. She also, with considerably more care, sent copies of the transcribed Covenant archive to 7 individuals. She had identified through her correspondent network as historians and archivists of genuine independence and integrity, scholars who were not affiliated with any major pack and who had professional reputations that would make their verification of the documents credible. She framed this as a request for peer review of newly discovered documentation, which was also technically accurate. She was very good at technical accuracy. Caleum prepared his presentation with the kind of focused preparation that comes from knowing that you are not simply presenting historical data, but making a case that will determine the future of a civilization. He was thorough and precise, and he asked her questions constantly, checking his understanding of the modern context against her more current knowledge, adjusting his framing to address the specific distortions and misunderstandings that had accumulated in the centuries of his sleep. She helped him understand the modern wolf world, not as someone explaining foreign customs to a visitor, but as someone who had lived inside those customs and knew their texture from the inside. The way the Omega designation sat on a person's identity, the particular weight of being told from birth that your nature was a limitation rather than a gift. She told him this without performing it, without making it into a story about suffering, simply describing the mechanics of a system and their effects with the accuracy of long observation. He listened, and he understood. Not in the way that powerful people sometimes understand things that do not touch them directly, with a comprehension that remains theoretical. He understood it the way someone understands something that changes what they will do. She could see it happening in him, the integration of information into intention, and what she saw forming in that integration was not rage, though the anger was present and genuine, but something more controlled and more permanent. Determination. The long kind. On the wine. Night before the conference, sitting in the great hall with the fire going and the candles burning, he said, "When this is done, when the documentation is on the record, and the laws are restored, and the consulate has been made to answer for what the system has become, what do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she had been asked before, not in those direct terms. What do you want? Not what do you need or what are your requirements, but what do you want? I want the archive properly funded, she said, and properly staffed. It should not be one person in a ruin. Yes, he said. What else? I want the guardian role recognized as what it actually is, not a heritage caretaking position. A scholarly and ceremonial role of genuine significance, compensated and respected accordingly. Yes, he said. What else? She looked at the fire. I want there to be a record, she said. Not of me specifically, but of this, of what it costs to hold something together. When the world has forgotten it matters, I want there to be a record of the women who stayed in this keep, who did the work for generations without any acknowledgement. Their names are in the archive. I want them on a wall somewhere in a language that everyone can read, not because they need recognition, but because the work they did deserves to be known. When she looked up, he was watching her with that unguarded expression that had become, over the weeks of working together, something she thought of as specific to her. The face he brought out only in her direction, the one that had nothing to do with the first alpha or the founding laws or the weight of 3,000 years, and everything to do with simply being a person in the presence of another person, he found remarkable. Those things will happen, he said. I promise you. She held the weight of that promise for a moment. Then she said, I also want to know what you want. This conversation should not only move in one direction. He looked at her steadily. You know what I want. She did know. She had known for some time, and she was closer now, much closer, to being ready to meet it with the directness it deserved. But she was also, she thought, a person who did not rush toward things simply because the waiting had become difficult. She was a person who waited until she was certain, and she was not quite certain yet, not because of doubt exactly, but because certainty, real certainty, required a completeness, of understanding that she did not rush. I know, she said. Give me a little more time. I have told you, he said, with a patience that was not performance but substance. I can wait. The Pack Historical Society conference was held in the Central Territories, in a building that had been designed to impress in the manner of institutions that confuse architectural grandeur with intellectual authority. Mara had been there once before for a regional archivist meeting, and had found it perfectly serviceable. She found it today, walking in beside Caleum, considerably more charged with the specific electricity of a situation that was about to become irrevocable. They had discussed how to handle his appearance. The question of who he was would be addressed in the presentation itself. But they had decided that walking in and simply announcing it in the lobby was not the right tactical approach. He was registered as a scholar. He looked like a person. He was, in fact, extraordinarily conspicuous because he was Caleum, and he could not entirely suppress the quality of his presence. But Mara had observed that in modern wolf society, people tended to assume that a very striking and powerfully present person was simply a high-status alpha from a pack they did not know, and that assumption could hold long enough for them to reach the presentation room. She was right about this mostly. They drew stares in the lobby, which she had expected. She drew stares of her own kind, the kind that Omegas without pack markers drew in gatherings of affiliated wolves, the particular quality of assessment that read, "As you do not belong here." She met each one with the same level direct attention she brought to everything, and watched them move on. What she had not entirely anticipated was the chairman. Eriksson Halverson was a large man, in the way that suggested the weight of power more than actual physical mass, silver-haired and well-dressed and carrying the specific manner of someone who had held authority for so long that he had stopped distinguishing between his preferences and the correct order of things. He was at the conference because the Halverson Pack sponsored it, which meant his presence here was ordinary. His attention fixing on Caleum from across the lobby was not. He could not have known. Not with certainty, but power has a quality that other power recognizes, and Halverson was looking at Caleum with the expression of a man who has just felt a shift in the foundation of something he considered solid. He looked at Mara next, and his expression changed to something she had more experience reading, the assessment of a person who has decided that an Omega alone constitutes a vulnerability to be exploited. He crossed the lobby toward them. She stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, just positioning, the instinctive recalibration of someone who has learned to manage difficult social dynamics by controlling the geometry of them. Halverson addressed Caleum directly, bypassing her entirely. He introduced himself with the smooth authority of a man accustomed to his name producing recognition and reaction. He asked, with the particular tonality of a casual question that is not casual, who Caleum was and which pack he represented. Caleum looked at Halverson. The look was not aggressive. It was simply fully present, the gold eyes bringing their complete attention to bear on a single point, and the effect of being the single point of that. Attention was apparently disorienting even for a man as politically calloused as the chairman, because Halverson's confident social rhythm stuttered slightly. Caleum said, "I represent the founding pack, the first one. You will hear more about this shortly." Then he walked past Halverson without pausing, and Mara followed, and she caught in the corner of her vision the exact moment the chairman's expression shifted from confused authority to something colder and more calculating. She filed it. She would need to account for it. They reached the presentation room with 20 minutes to spare. The room held perhaps 300 people, which was a full house for this conference, and she was glad for the prior correspondents she had sent the transcriptions to, 5 of whom were in the audience and had confirmed their attendance with the specific careful language of people who understood they were about to witness something significant. The conference was being broadcast on the territorial network. The room had 4 recording devices visible from the front, and likely more she could not see. Everything was in place. Mara sat in the front row. She had offered to introduce him, and he had declined, saying simply that an introduction would raise questions about who was introducing him that they did not yet want to answer. So he took the podium alone, and the room fell into the specific quiet of a gathered audience that has not yet decided what it is watching, but has registered that whatever it is watching matters. He began simply. He said, "My name is Caleum. I am the first Alpha. I apologize for the very long absence." The room produced a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite disbelief, and not quite the sound of 300 people experiencing simultaneous cognitive rupture, but was something that contained elements of all 3. He continued. He laid out the evidence methodically, the Covenant archive, the authenticated documentation, the reconstruction of the founding laws, cross-referenced against the historical record, and the independent verification by the 5 scholars in the room. He was not performing. He was not grandstanding. He was presenting facts with the comprehensive clarity of someone who has spent weeks preparing to make a case that cannot be argued with, and the effect was devastating in its simplicity. Mara watched the room. She watched the historians in the second row leaning forward with the particular posture of people whose professional assumptions are being systematically revised. She watched the pack representatives from minor territories listening with the focused attention of people who are recognizing that something has just changed in their favor. She watched 2 of the consulate's observers in the back row conferring in urgent whispers, reaching for their communication devices, and she watched one of them leave the room at speed in the direction of where she was fairly certain the chairman was standing. She had anticipated all of this. What she had not anticipated was the moment 30 minutes into the presentation when Caleum deviated from the outline they had prepared and said, "There is one more thing I want to address before this presentation concludes. Not from the archive, from my own direct knowledge." He looked at her, in the front row, in front of 300 people and 4 recording devices and the territorial network broadcast. He looked at her with the gold eyes and the unguarded expression she had come to think of as specific to her, and he said, "The guardian who woke me spent 3 years in isolation, doing work that the world had decided was meaningless, with no promise of recognition, no companionship, no acknowledgement that her duty was real. She did it because she believed it was true, because she understood that devotion is not weakness, and continuity is not servitude, and the act of keeping faith with something the world has forgotten is among the most powerful things a person can do." He paused. "When the founding laws are restored, the guardian role will be recognized in the terms the Covenant describes, which is to say as a position of foundational authority equal to any other in the structure of our society. Mara Ashvale kept this world's most important promise. This world owes her, and people like her, a debt that begins to be paid today. The room was very quiet. Mara did not cry. She was not, generally speaking, a person who cried easily, and she had her grandmother's instinct for not performing emotions that were genuine, because genuine emotions were private and valuable, and not meant for display in rooms full of strangers. But she felt the words settle into her, with the particular weight of something that was being recognized, not simply acknowledged but actually seen, which was different, which was the thing she had not known she had been waiting for, because she had never let herself want it clearly enough to know she was waiting. She nodded at him, slightly, a nod that was a whole conversation. He returned to his outline. The Halverson Pack's legal challenge arrived before the presentation was finished. It was expected. The chairman had activated the consulate's emergency protocols, citing what Mara thought was an impressively creative interpretation of the Heritage Site Management Codes, to argue that any material from the Ashvale Keep archive was consulate property, and its presentation in a public forum, without authorization, was a violation of the preservation framework. The 5 independent scholars were prepared for this. 2 of them rose immediately and stated on the public record, which was the conference broadcast, that they had independently verified the authenticity of the documents, and that the authentication predated any consulate claim, as the documents had been shared with them privately 3 weeks prior, before any formal consulate interest in the material had been established. One of them, a small, fierce woman named Dr. Adaize Okonkwo, who had been studying founding period material for 40 years, and had the specific energy of someone who has been waiting their entire career for exactly this kind of moment, announced that she had already submitted copies to the International Wolf Historical Preservation Society under emergency authentication protocols, which meant that the material was now in the global record, and no single governing body could suppress it. The room did not erupt. It went through several transformations, rapid and visible, like watching weather change. First the stunned quiet, then the voices, overlapping, people turning to each other with the energy of people who have just understood that the terms of something important have shifted permanently. Then the specific sound of institutional authority encountering a reality it cannot absorb, the consulate observers on their devices, the pack representatives from the Halverson territories conferring. Urgently, the conference organizers looking at each other with the expression of people who had planned a historical conference and gotten something else entirely. Caleum stood at the podium through all of it with the patience of someone who has waited 3,000 years and is now watching a rearrangement that was always going to be necessary. Halverson himself appeared at the room's entrance at some point during this. He looked at Caleum at the podium. He looked at the room. He looked at Mara in the front row, and she looked back at him with the same steady attention she brought to everything, and whatever he saw in her face completed some calculation he had been running, because the aggressive certainty drained out of his posture, and what replaced it was something she read as a man confronting the full scope of what he was actually dealing with for the first time. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she felt after the hardest mornings in the keep, when the work had been particularly cold, and the isolation had been particularly present, and she had done it anyway. She felt the bone-deep satisfaction of work that was necessary having been done. If this story is reaching you, please subscribe. There is more to come, and you will not want to miss what happens next. The weeks that followed were the most complex of Mara's life, which had contained, she thought, a reasonable baseline of complexity, given that she had spent it alone in a ruin doing work the world considered pointless. The consulate did not collapse. Systems that have held power for 4 decades do not collapse in response to a single public revelation of their illegitimacy, even when that revelation is comprehensive and documented and broadcast across the territorial network. What they do is what all systems do when confronted with an existential challenge. They fight, they negotiate, they look for weak points, and they adapt, or they fail to adapt. And which of those outcomes you get depends on the quality of the people pushing the challenge and the specific nature of what the challenge is asking for. Caleum understood this. He had built the original version of Wolf Society, and had watched it be dismantled across 3,000 years, which gave him a specific and not entirely comforting perspective on how long transformation actually takes. He was not impatient. He was relentless, which was a different thing, the quality of someone who does not expect speed, but does not stop. Mara understood it differently, from the inside, from the experience of being an Omega in a system that had spent centuries perfecting the tools of Omega erasure. She understood the specific ways the consulate would try to minimize the impact of the revelation, the technical arguments, the procedural delays, the attempts to frame the Covenant archive as historical curiosity rather than legally binding document. She had read enough consulate communications over the years to speak their language fluently. Together they were, she thought, a reasonably effective combination. The Halverson Pact's legal challenge collapsed within a month. The authentication by the International Preservation Society was unassailable, and 3 of the 7 consulate members who were not Halverson affiliates defected from the chairman's position almost immediately after the conference, recognizing which direction the current was running. Halverson himself resigned the chairmanship 6 weeks after the conference under a pressure that came from enough directions simultaneously that pinpointing which single force had moved him would have been an exercise in missing the point. He was replaced by an interim council that included, for the first time in recorded history, 2 Omega representatives, one of whom was an academic who had spent her career arguing for exactly this inclusion and who cried visibly when she was sworn in. The founding laws themselves required a full territorial assembly to be formally reinstated, which took 4 months of political work that Mara participated in not from the sidelines but from the front, because Caleum insisted on it, and the Covenant Archive supported his insistence with language that left no interpretive room. The guardian of the Restoration had a voice in the Restoration. She spoke at 3 territorial assemblies. She gave testimony on the Omega experience in modern wolf society to the interim council that was simultaneously the most difficult thing she had ever done and the most necessary. She was precise and honest, and she did not perform either strength or fragility. She simply described what she knew from living inside it. The response to her testimony varied. Some of it was what she expected: skepticism and resistance from pack members who had built their identities on a hierarchy they were not prepared to surrender. Some of it was what she had hoped for, but had disciplined herself not to expect. Genuine response from people who had understood something about their own experience through hers. Beta wolves, who had always felt the constraints of the intermediary role without having language for it. Young alphas who had felt burdened by the demands of dominance rather than served by them. And omegas, many omegas, from territories across the network, who wrote and sent messages through the channels she had opened, and who said versions of the same thing, which was that they had not known someone was keeping the words until someone kept the words. Those messages were the ones she read last at night. She kept them in a separate file. And through all of it, the political work and the legal process and the testimony and the correspondence, there was the other thing, the thing between her and Caleum that had been building since before either of them could name it, and that was now very close to the moment of being named directly. They were still in the keep. She had not thought about this as a choice. Exactly. It was simply that the work was centered there, and that was where they were. But she was aware that she had made it anyway, on some level below explicit decision. The keep was changing around them. The consulate had released funding for proper restoration as part of the initial negotiation terms, and a structural engineer had visited and given a report that was more optimistic than Mara had expected, and there were now 2 assistants helping her with the archive work. Young wolves fresh from history. Programs who had applied for the positions in the first week the listing was posted. She had hired them with the care she brought to everything. The keep was becoming the thing it was supposed to be. Alive. Present. Used by people who understood what they were using. And she was sleeping better than she had in 3 years, which she attributed partly to the fact that she no longer carried the weight of the work entirely alone, and partly to something she was less willing to examine directly, which was that the presence in the keep was no longer the presence of something felt, but not seen. It was the presence of someone who sat across from her at the table where she ate breakfast and who she had watched over the past months become increasingly human in the best sense of the word, increasingly present in the specific texture of the current moment, rather than the vast weight of history, increasingly interested in the small details of the ordinary days that she had always inhabited. With care, he had learned to make tea. This seemed like a small thing, but she had found herself attending to it, with perhaps more interest than was strictly justified, watching him figure out the camp stove and the ratio of tea to water, and the precise moment to pour, with the focused attention he brought to everything, and feeling, watching this, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She had decided she was certain. She decided this on a morning approximately 5 months. After the conference, in the great hall, after she had finished the old words, she had continued saying them every morning. It had not seemed like something to stop. The purpose of them had changed, or rather had revealed itself more completely. But the words themselves still felt true, and the ritual of saying them still felt like the right way to begin a day in this place. She said them and opened her eyes, and Caleum was there, which he sometimes was on the mornings he woke early, sitting on the steps of the dais with tea for both of them, watching her with that expression. She walked to the dais and sat beside him on the steps. She accepted the tea. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I am certain now." He was very still. "I understand what I am choosing," she said. "I have taken the time I needed. I have watched you for 5 months with the understanding that I was watching someone I might choose to be bonded to, and what I have seen is a person who listens with his whole attention, and who does not require me to be different from what I am, and who has, in the process of doing the work that needed to be done, consistently treated my judgment as the thing it is, rather than the thing the world has tried to make it." She paused. "I have also seen someone who learns how to make tea with the same seriousness he brings to writing founding laws, which I find more endearing than I expected to." Something moved through his expression that was the unguarded version of everything she had been watching for 5 months. "I am choosing this," she said, fully and with understanding. "Are you?" 3,000 years ago and every morning since and now, he said. His voice had the quality of something that had been waiting to be spoken for a very long time and was finally being allowed to. "Yes, I am choosing this." She put down her tea. She turned to look at him directly, the same direct attention she had given him on the first morning when he opened his gold eyes, and looked at her across the length of the empty hall. He looked back with the same full presence. "Then we should probably talk about what a covenant bond actually entails," she said. "In practical terms." "Yes," he said. "We probably should." He took her hand. It was a simple gesture, his scarred hand around her worn, work-rough one, and it was the most natural thing she had ever felt, like placing a stone in exactly the right point in a wall that has been waiting for it, like finishing a sentence that has been open for a very long time. The keep around them had that quality, that feeling of the stones exhaling, presence and warmth, and the sense of something immense and patient completing itself. She did not cry then either, but she came closer than she usually did. "Tell me in the comments what you thought of Mara and Caleum's story. Tell me if you believe that devotion is its own kind of power. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do. This channel is a place for stories that believe some things are worth waiting for." Epilogue. 3 years after the conference, the Territorial Assembly voted on the formal restoration of the founding laws by a margin that surprised even the people who had been working toward it, because the mathematics of the vote included PAC members who had been expected to resist and who voted yes instead, and those votes were the ones that told a story about how thoroughly the ground had shifted. The Ashvale Keep was reclassified from Heritage Preservation Site to Active Covenant Institution, a new category that had been created specifically for it, and that came with the resources and recognition the classification implied. The archive was properly funded and housed 2 full-time archivists, 3 research associates, and a rotating fellowship for scholars of founding period history. The restoration of the physical structure was complete on the east wing and ongoing in the north, proceeding carefully under the supervision of engineers who had come to understand that working on a building this old and this particular required a specific kind of attention. On the wall inside the archive room entrance, Installed on the morning of the territorial assembly vote was a slate panel carved with names. 47 names. The women of the Ashvale lineage who had kept the keep, listed in order from the oldest Mara had been able to find in the records to the most recent. At the bottom of the list were 2 names. The first was her grandmother's. The second was hers. She stood in front of that wall on the morning after the installation. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, who had given her the broom and the candle box, and the old words, and the understanding that some work is worth doing, regardless of whether anyone living can see why. She thought about all of them, 47 women, and the mornings they had swept, and the candles they had lit, and the faith they had kept in something larger than any single life. She thought about what faith costs, and what it builds, and the way the ordinary days are never only ordinary. Caleum came to stand beside her. He looked at the wall. He looked at her. He put his hand in hers. "Your grandmother would have liked this," he said. "She would have said it was too conspicuous," Mara said. She had strong feelings about keeping things plain. She paused. But yes, she would have liked it. They stood together in the archive room entrance with, the names on the wall and the sounds of the keep alive around them, the voices of the research fellows in the next room, the structural work happening in the north wing, the wind in the pines outside doing its usual thing, and the candles burning in the great hall in their sequence, lit that morning by Mara's own hand, as they would always be lit, because some rituals are not only habits, but the shape of what you are. In the restored Omega representation framework that had been established under the new governing structure, Mara served as the first covenant keeper, a role that was formally what her grandmother had always said it was informally, the voice that held the original meaning of things when the world was in danger of forgetting. She took the role seriously, and without grandeur, the same way she had always taken her work, as something that mattered, and therefore deserved her full attention, in the wolf world that was being slowly, imperfectly, necessarily rebuilt around the foundations that 3,000 years of deliberate misdirection had tried to bury. There were setbacks. There were councils that dragged their feet, and pack leaders who complied in letter while resisting in spirit, and young Omegas who had grown up so thoroughly inside the old system that the new terms of their dignity felt strange and frightening before they felt true. Mara did not expect otherwise. She had always understood that real change was not an event, but a sustained practice, the kind of work that required doing every day without knowing how long it would take, the way you keep a candle burning in an empty hall, because the keeping matters regardless of the result you can see. She kept the candle on the throne. It seemed like the right thing to continue. The throne was occupied now, in the manner of being claimed again by the one who had always belonged to it. But a candle on a throne is not only for the absent, it is for the light itself. It is a reminder that someone thought. The light was worth keeping. Some mornings she said the old words alone. Some mornings Caleum said them with her, his voice beside hers in the ancient tongue, and the hall held them both with the same stone patience it had always held everything. Indifferent to human time, faithful to something larger. This was not a fairy tale ending. Mara would have been suspicious of a fairy tale ending, because she had lived long enough in difficult reality to know that the good versions of things require constant tending, and that nothing worth having arrives complete. This was something better than a fairy tale ending. This was a beginning that knew itself to be a beginning. This was 2 people who had chosen each other with full understanding, working every day at something that mattered, in a place made of stones that remembered how long things could endure when someone cared enough to stay. The keep stood. The candles burned. The old words were spoken every morning by a woman who had always known, in the place beneath knowing where the truest things live, that devotion is not weakness, and continuity is not servitude, and the act of keeping faith with something the world has forgotten is among the most powerful things a person can do. And somewhere in the pine forest outside the ancient walls, wolves ran free under stars that had been arranged since before memory, in patterns that a woman named Mara Ashvale had tried all her life to map, and had finally, in the end, understood. Not as a puzzle to be solved, as a sky to be lived under, as something vast and constant that does not need to be explained to be true. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If Mara's devotion moved you, if Caleum's patience stayed with you, if any part of this story felt like something you needed today, please leave a like and tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. I will see you there.